I found the camp on the third day, and the moment I understood what I was looking at, I should have turned around, walked back to my truck, and driven straight out of those hills without stopping. I didn't. That's the part I still can't make peace with. My name is Rebecca Callahan. In October of 2021, I was a freelance geological survey contractor working out of Rapid City, South Dakota. Decent work, mostly solo, mostly unglamorous. You drive out into the middle of nowhere. You assess the structural integrity of old mine shafts. You file reports. You get paid. I'd been doing it for 6 years. I'd been into hundreds of mines, most of them in the Black Hills. I was not the kind of person who scared easily. The job that week was a 3-day assessment of 7 abandoned shafts in a remote stretch of Black Hills National Forest, approximately 8 miles northeast of Nemo. If you know the area, you know what I mean by remote. The access road ended about 1.5 miles from the survey site. There was no cell signal. My satellite communicator had a 2-hour battery life on a good day. I had a tent, a week's worth of supplies, and a truck I parked at a pullout just off Forest Service Road 252. The first 2 days were routine. 4 shafts assessed, all in the condition you'd expect from structures that hadn't been maintained since the 1940s. Deteriorating timber supports, water infiltration, partial collapses near the lower levels. I took measurements, shot photographs, made notes. I camped at the base of a granite ridge about 1/4 mile from the survey cluster. I slept fine. I saw deer. I didn't see another person. Day 3 started wrong before I even got to the mine. My coffee thermos, which I always set on the tailgate of the truck before I broke camp, was on the ground when I walked over to it that morning, face down in the dirt. I stood there for a second, looking at it like it was going to explain itself. A gust of wind, I thought, an animal nudging it in the night. I picked it up, checked it, and didn't think about it again. The 5th shaft was the one that changed everything. It was about 3/4 of a mile into a ravine that ran east from the main drainage, and it took me longer to reach than I'd mapped for. The terrain had shifted noticeably from the older survey imagery I was working off. When I got to the entrance, it looked standard, a horizontal adit cut into the hillside, maybe 5 feet wide, reinforced with old square-set timbering that had been deteriorating for decades. My headlamp caught the usual things: rockfall, standing water near the floor, ore cart rails half buried in sediment. Then I got about 30 feet in, rounded the first curve in the drift, and stopped. It took me a full 15 seconds to process what I was seeing. Not because it was strange exactly, because it was completely, undeniably functional. Someone had been living in that mine, not years ago, not in some dusty, abandoned way that you could dismiss as old history. Recently. The sleeping area was on a raised platform of salvaged lumber, elevated off the wet floor. Someone had thought that through. There was a water collection system rigged near a seep in the ceiling wall, a folded tarp, a length of plastic tubing, a 5-gallon bucket. The bucket was 3/4 full, and the water looked clear. There were food stores, sealed containers, nothing perishable, stacked in a systematic way along the far wall, a folded wool blanket, a Coleman lantern, the kind with replaceable fuel cartridges. 3 of the cartridges were empty, lined up neatly beside the lantern. I did not touch anything. I know that sounds obvious in retrospect, but standing there in the dark, in a mine shaft that had no business being occupied, the thought that crossed my mind was not danger. Not yet. The thought was, this person has been here a long time. This person knows what they're doing. I spent maybe 4 minutes in that chamber before I started to feel the wrongness of it. The way the silence felt different in there. The way every drip of water from the ceiling hit louder than it should have. I backed out the way I'd come in, turned around when I reached the daylight, and stood in the ravine for a moment, just breathing. I should have pulled out. I know that now. I told myself it was probably a squatter, probably a transient, probably someone who'd moved on weeks ago. I told myself a lot of things. I went back to note the shaft's structural condition in my field log and then started back toward camp. That's when I found the paper. It was folded twice, wedged into a crack in the rock face about 40 meters from the shaft entrance, at approximately eye level. in a spot you'd only notice if you were moving slowly and paying attention. I don't know what made me stop. I almost didn't. I unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, pencil on what looked like notebook paper, worn soft at the creases. Accurate. Genuinely accurate. The drainage, the ridgeline, the rock formation I'd been using as a navigation landmark, the position of all 7 mine shafts, correctly located, the access road, the pullout where I had parked my truck, and at the pullout, drawn in pencil with the same clean, careful hand as everything else, a small tent symbol, and beside it, a small X. I stood there in that ravine and I turned that paper over and over in my hands, trying to figure out what I was holding. Was this old? Was it drawn before I arrived? Was it drawn after? There was no date on it. There was no name. The paper was soft from handling, but not yellowed. There was no way to know. I want to be clear. I had told no one exactly where I was camping. The company that hired me had a general GPS radius from my satellite communicator. My emergency contact knew I was somewhere in the Nemo area. No one knew I'd pitched my tent at that pullout. I'd chosen it on arrival because it was flat and sheltered, and I liked the look of it. I walked back to camp faster than I've ever moved on a survey job. I spent the rest of that afternoon dismantling my tent and packing my gear. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself I was probably overreacting. I loaded everything into the truck and then sat in the driver's seat for a while, engine off, watching the tree line. Nothing moved. The ravine was quiet. The afternoon light came through the pines in long yellow bars, and it was honestly beautiful. And I hated it. I left my GPS unit charging on the passenger seat, plugged into the truck's 12-volt port, and walked back up the trail one last time to get a photograph of an outcropping I'd missed in the morning. 10 minutes, maybe 15. When I came back, the truck was locked exactly as I'd left it. I know because I checked my keys. They were in my vest pocket. Both doors locked. The passenger window was up. The GPS unit was on the driver's seat, not the passenger seat, not on the floor, on the driver's seat, centered, screen side up, still charging. I stood outside the driver's window for a long time looking at it through the glass before I unlocked the door. I drove out of there without stopping. Didn't get out to open the gate at Forest Service Road 252. I drove through it. I filed a report with the Forest Service the following morning. 2 weeks later, I heard back. The ranger I spoke to was professional and careful with his words, but what he told me is something I've thought about almost every day since. He said the area around those shafts had been flagged in 2018 after a man named Gerald Prue, a former Army survival instructor who'd had prior confrontations with 2 other survey crews operating in the hills, went missing somewhere in that drainage. His family reported him missing. A search was conducted. He was never found. The ranger told me they'd go take a look at the shaft I'd described. I asked if he thought Prue was still out there. There was a pause before he answered. He said they'd found evidence of occupation in that area before, off and on, over the years. He said they'd never been able to confirm anything. I asked him how the GPS got onto the driver's seat of a locked truck. He didn't have an answer for that. He said he'd make a note of it. I haven't been back to that part of the Black Hills. I still think about that map, the tent symbol, the X, and I ask myself the question I've never been able to answer. Was it drawn before I arrived or after? Because one of those answers is frightening, and the other one is something else entirely. Drop your theory in the comments, because I genuinely don't know which one scares me more. It took me 4 days to understand what I was actually watching. By the time I understood, the only thing I could do was leave. I left, and I've hated myself for it every single day for the past 6 years. My name is Dennis Howe. I'm a high school history teacher from Sioux Falls. In August of 2019, I took my 16-year-old son Jake on a 5-day camping trip to Custer State Park in the Black Hills. Just the 2 of us, which was the whole point. I'd been divorced for 3 years. Jake was 16, which meant he was getting to the age where a father becomes an inconvenience rather than a person, and I wanted that trip to matter. I planned it for months. We pulled into the campground on a Sunday afternoon and set up at Site 15, a good spot, wooded, with a fire ring and a partial view of the creek. The neighboring site, Site 14, was already occupied. I noticed them in the way you notice anyone sharing close quarters in a campground. A quick, polite assessment filed away. A family. Mother, father, 3 kids, ranging in age from maybe 7 to 12 or 13. A large canvas tent, very organized setup, 2 coolers lined up with military precision beside a folding table. The father was stacking firewood when we pulled in. He looked up, nodded once, went back to what he was doing. Nothing alarming. A family, camping, that's all it was. The first thing I noticed, really noticed, not just peripherally, was the silence. We were set up and cooking dinner by around 6 that evening, and Site 14 was about 30 feet away through a line of ponderosa pines. At a campground, sound carries. You hear people. You hear kids, especially. The sound of children at a campground is one of those background constants you stop hearing after a while, the same way you stop hearing traffic if you live near a highway. I never stopped hearing silence from Site 14. Jake pointed it out first, actually. He said it while we were eating. "Those kids are weird." I told him not to be rude. He shrugged and said he wasn't being rude, they just never talked. I looked over. The 3 children were sitting at the folding table eating in perfect silence. The parents sat across from them. No one spoke. No one laughed. The youngest, a girl, maybe 7, was eating with both hands in her lap between bites, sitting completely straight, eyes down. I remember thinking, strict family. Religious, maybe. Some people raise their kids like that. I remember actively generating explanations. Day 2. Jake and I did a morning hike and came back early afternoon. As we walked past Site 14 on the way to our tent, the mother, I never learned her name, was washing dishes at the camp spigot. She smiled at me. It was a perfectly normal smile, the kind you give a neighbor, and she said, "Beautiful day." And I said it was. But as I walked past, I looked at the children. All 3 of them were sitting near the entrance of the tent. Not playing, not reading. Just sitting, facing slightly inward, hands in laps. Quiet. The father came over that evening while Jake and I had our fire going. He was friendly, in a very deliberate way. Introduced himself as Ray, said they were from Minneapolis, said the kids were homeschooled, and that he and his wife believed in structured outdoor experience. That phrase, he used it exactly. Structured outdoor experience. He admired the fire, asked where we'd hiked, said his family had been camping in the Black Hills for years, knew the area well. He was articulate and calm and made good eye contact the whole time. But he never mentioned his kids by name. Not once in that entire conversation. Day 3 is when it shifted. Jake told me at breakfast that one of the kids, the oldest, a boy, had spoken to him the day before at the water spigot when Jake went to refill our bottles. He'd said it quietly, one word, while keeping his eyes on the ground. Jake didn't think he'd heard it right. He said the word was help. I sat with that for a long time. I told myself it could have been anything, a game, a joke, a kid messing around with a stranger for a laugh. I told myself Jake might have misheard. I went back and forth. You run these calculations in your head, the cost of being wrong if you act versus the cost of being wrong if you don't. I kept telling myself I didn't have enough information. That afternoon, I walked the long way around the campground loop, back through the trees behind Site 14, where I had a partial sightline to their camp without being obvious about it. I told myself I was just looking, just making sure everything was fine. The 3 children were cleaning tools at the folding table. Not utensils, not camp cookware. Folding knives, a hatchet, a filleting knife, laid out in a row, each child working on a specific tool with a sharpening stone, in silence, in sequence. The father stood at the edge of the camp with his arms crossed, watching. The mother was not visible. None of the children spoke. None of them looked up. I walked back to my site and stood there for a long time staring at the creek. That night, after Jake was asleep, I lay in my sleeping bag listening. I don't know what I expected to hear. What I heard, just after midnight, was crying. Very faint, from the direction of Site 14. High, thin, exhausted crying, the kind that doesn't have enough left in it to be loud. It lasted perhaps 45 seconds, then it stopped the moment I shifted position in my bag, the moment I moved. Like something had been listening for me. I went to the camp host the next morning. I explained what I'd observed. The host, a retired couple, very kind, went over and spoke to the family. Ray came out, was pleasant and cooperative, showed them the kids, who were calm and apparently fine. The camp host came back and apologized to me. Said the children were just tired from a long hike. Said the family seemed perfectly normal. I called the non-emergency sheriff's line from the camp host's landline. They took a report. A deputy drove out and spoke to the family for about 10 minutes. The family was polite. The children answered questions in short, quiet sentences. The deputy told me he didn't see any sign of distress and that without specific evidence he couldn't do anything further. He suggested I consider whether I might be misinterpreting a family with a strict upbringing. Strict upbringing. I lay awake until 3 in the morning trying to decide what to do. I made a list in my notebook of everything I'd seen. I decided that in the morning I would call the Custer County Sheriff's Department directly and request a full welfare check with a social worker present. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of a vehicle. By the time I got my shoes on and got outside, Site 14 was nearly empty. The family was packing the last of their gear into a dark blue SUV. They worked with that same silent efficiency, the children carrying loads, no one speaking, the whole operation moving like a machine. I stood at the edge of my site and watched. The father looked over at me once from across the camp and he nodded in exactly the same way he had when we first arrived. Once. Then he got in the SUV. They were gone by 5:45. The whole campground felt different after that. Quieter in a wrong way, like something had been extracted from the air. I walked over to Site 14. It was clean. Not clean like someone had tidied up. Clean like the site had been processed. Not a food scrap, not a boot print in the soft dirt around the fire ring. I was standing there looking at it when I noticed my truck. There was something tucked under the driver's side windshield wiper. A folded piece of paper, torn from a spiral notebook, the spiral edge still on one side. I unfolded it. The handwriting was a child's, careful, labored, the letters slightly uneven in size. It said 6 words. We won't be at the next place either. I called the Custer County Sheriff as soon as the dispatcher came on at 7 a.m. I gave them everything I had. Ray, Minneapolis, dark blue SUV, 3 children, the note. A detective called me back 2 days after I got home to Sioux Falls. He told me he'd looked into it. Said there was a family matching that description who had voluntarily gone off-grid, legally, no active missing persons case. The parents had filed the appropriate paperwork. He said the children were homeschooled, no compulsory reporting issues. He said there'd been a prior CPS matter in Minnesota that had been resolved. I asked him about the note. He said it was a child's note, and that without more context, he couldn't interpret it as a credible threat indicator. I've looked up Minnesota missing children reports more times than I can count. I've searched for families matching that description. I've found nothing that I can pin down, nothing I can confirm. I keep the note in my desk at school. I've looked at it so many times the paper has gone soft along the fold lines. 6 words. Past tense. Won't be. Like she already knew before she got in that SUV that wherever they were going next, nobody was going to come looking either. If you've ever seen something like this, a child, a family, something that felt wrong in a way you couldn't quite name, I want to know. Leave it in the comments. Because I've been sitting with this alone for a long time and I'm not the only one. For 11 months, I thought I was losing my mind. Then I found the notebook and I understood the truth. And the truth was that I wasn't losing my mind at all. Somebody was trying to make sure I looked like I had. My name is Marcus Tilley.
I'm 52 years old, and for 7 years I worked as a night custodian and informal security presence at a privately operated historical archive in Deadwood, South Dakota. The building housed one of the more significant private collections of Black Hills frontier-era materials in the state. Photographs, ledgers, correspondence, surveying records, deeds, and claims documents going back to the 1870s gold rush. The kind of collection that gets cited in academic papers, the kind of collection people drove hundreds of miles to request access to. I worked the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. For most of those 7 years, especially after March of 2020 when the building reduced its access hours significantly, I was the only human being inside that building for most of my shift. I want to be careful about how I describe what I started noticing, because I'm aware of how it sounds. I know the way things can look when you work alone at night in a quiet building. I know the way the mind fills space. I have no history of psychological problems, no history of substance abuse, nothing that would explain what I'm about to tell you. I need you to understand that before I go any further. It started with the photograph. There is, or there was, a framed photograph in the hallway outside the staff break room, approximately 12 by 16 inches in a wooden frame mounted at roughly eye level. A formal group portrait of miners taken sometime in the 1880s based on the equipment and clothing. 4 men standing in front of what appears to be a mine headframe. I had walked past that photograph hundreds of times, thousands of times over the course of 7 years. I had looked at it countless times during late-night breaks. I knew it. 4 men, left to right, a heavy-set man in suspenders, a younger man with a beard, a man in a wide-brimmed hat, and a 4th man standing slightly apart from the others, taller, with an unusual quality to his expression that I always thought looked almost smug. In the late summer of 2020, I remember the date because I wrote it down, I walked past the photograph at approximately 2:40 in the morning and stopped. There were 3 men in the photograph. I stood there for a long time. I took the frame off the wall and carried it to the break room under the fluorescent light and looked at it for 10 minutes. 3 men. The heavy-set man in suspenders, the younger bearded man, the man in the wide-brimmed hat. The space where the 4th figure had stood was not empty. The composition of the photograph simply didn't have a gap. The 3 remaining men filled the frame the way 3 men fill a frame. There was no visible evidence that a 4th figure had been removed or altered. I hung the photograph back on the wall. I went home at 6 a.m., slept for 4 hours, and came back that night convinced I had misremembered. Maybe it had always been 3 men. I'd worked overnight shifts for 7 years, which is a lot of sleep deprivation spread across a lot of time. I walked past the photograph again. 3 men. I started taking photographs on my phone, not obsessively, not frantically, methodically. Every item in the collection that I passed regularly on my rounds photographed and date-stamped. I told myself it was just so I'd have a reference, proof against my own memory. Over the following 8 weeks, I documented 11 changes. A photograph that had shown 4 men now showed 3. A ledger entry from October 1878 had a name in the 3rd column that was now replaced by a careful scratch-out in ink that matched the surrounding period text. Meaning, whoever did this had sourced matching period-appropriate ink or had access to archival forgery tools. An 1882 property claim document had an addendum section that I had photographed on my phone on August 3rd. On September 9th, that addendum was missing, and the binding of the document had been carefully restitched. I had a before and after photograph of both. An 1879 correspondence file listed 11 letters. I had photographed the index. It now listed 10. Every single alteration, every one, appeared to target references to the same name. C. Aldrin Marsh. I didn't know that name. I had no reason to. I spent 2 nights on my personal laptop during breaks trying to find him in digitized historical records. What I found was sparse and strange. Court documents from 1879 that referenced a C. Aldrin Marsh in connection with a land fraud scheme and the deaths of 3 indigenous scouts. Charges that were subsequently dropped with no explanation in the record. A single mention in a Black Hills newspaper from 1880 referring to his departure from the territory. After that, nothing. As if someone had spent 140 years making sure Marsh didn't accumulate historical weight. In January of 2020, before any of this started, the archive had brought on a new part-time archivist on a digitization grant.
I hadn't paid much attention. His access hours were daytime, 9 to 4, and by the time I arrived, he was always gone. His name was on the staff board in the director's office, Christopher A. Marsh. I looked at that name on the staff board for a long time. Then I went back to my rounds. For 3 months, I said nothing. I kept photographing. I kept documenting. I tried to think about what I actually had, what it actually meant, whether it meant anything. A man named Marsh working to erase a man named Marsh from a historical record that had already gone to considerable lengths to erase him. I turned it over and over, and I couldn't find an angle that made it harmless. What changed everything was the building log. The building log was a standard hardcover record book kept on a shelf by the main entrance. Every staff member, every visitor, every access event logged by hand in sequence. I wrote in it every night, arrival time, departure time, which rooms I accessed, anything I observed. 7 years of entries in my handwriting. In April of 2021, I happened to reread an entry I'd made the previous November. The date was right, the handwriting was mine, the format was correct, but the room sequence was wrong. I had logged myself as being in the reading room at 11 p.m. and the East Archive corridor at midnight. I remembered that night because I'd found a water stain developing on the corridor ceiling and made a specific note about it. In the log, the rooms were reversed. East Archive at 11, reading room at midnight. It was a small change, the kind of change that would be almost impossible to prove or disprove without a second reference. Except I had one, because I had photographed my own log entries on my phone on the same night as part of my documentation routine. The photograph showed the original entry, reading room at 11, corridor at midnight. The physical log showed the opposite, my handwriting, my log, altered after the fact. I sat with that for 2 days before I went to the director. I brought everything, printed photographs, dated and ordered, a written summary, the staff board with Christopher A. Marsh's name, the historical background on C. Aldrin Marsh, the altered log entries, all of it. The director reviewed it over the course of a week. 2 weeks after I submitted my documentation, Christopher A. Marsh resigned from the grant position. The director told me only that the matter had been handled internally, that my employment record was clean, and that she was grateful for my diligence. She used that word, diligence. No police, no investigation as far as I know. The photograph in the hallway was never restored. The ledger with the scratched name was never corrected. Whatever C. Aldrin Marsh had done, or what had been done to him, it remains absent from that collection. The alterations that Christopher made are still in place, and the collection that researchers come from across the country to study reflects them. I still have every photograph I took on my phone. I've shown them to exactly no one, which tells you something about what I think would happen if I did. I've thought about this situation from every direction. Who Christopher Marsh was to C. Aldrin Marsh, descendant, family member, obsessive. I don't know. Whether what he was doing was erasure of shame or erasure of evidence or something else entirely, I don't know. What I do know is that for 11 months, someone shared a building with me, waited for me to leave rooms, and carefully altered the physical record of history while adjusting the log of my own movements to make me look like the one doing it. I walked past that photograph every night, without knowing that the space where a man once stood had been quietly, professionally emptied. The fourth man in the photograph, whoever he was, is gone now. The archive's copy of history doesn't include him, and somewhere, someone made a decision that that was fine. I keep my documentation in a folder on a hard drive, backed up in 2 places, because that's what you do when you learn that things can disappear from the record and the record won't tell you it ever happened. Think carefully about which part of this story bothers you the most. Then think about why. If you made it this far through all 3 of these, you already know something most people don't.